Before awakening, there is sleeping. As consciousness, not in recognition of its formless integrity, there is instead an identification to form, to appearance. But appearance is a condition of consciousness, an expression. Unconsciousness. You see forms such as thinking and feeling is of you, but is not you. Those things are happening. The awakening was more of a realization. A realization where there was a complete acceptance of all things as it was. There was no longer trying to do anything in terms of seeking, in terms of trying to sort my life out. I'd come to see that thinking was not reality. The orientation of one's thinking was not a way to reality, was not reality. So there's no longer using thinking. There's no longer using thought as a means to seek. In that acceptance, in that not doing anything with the paradigm of thinking, the idea of Steve. Suddenly, there was going beyond the paradigm of that thinking, of that idea. There was just an awareness. It came from just accepting it as it was, thinking as it was. It was at that point that thinking began to then dissipate. Because as consciousness, just being aware of one's thinking, not doing anything with it. Simply just being aware. the identity just began to undo. In its dissipation, there was a fear. There was a not knowing. There was just simply knowing that thinking is not reality, and there was just acceptance of thinking, and it was just now beginning to undo. The idea of Steve is kind of just falling away. As it fell away, as I went beyond that knowing of the I, as awareness, there was just the remaining aware. No longer identified with thinking. Thinking just then undone. The mind then reflected consciousness as nothing, as just formless awareness. It was then that I realized that mind reflects consciousness. Mind is consciousness. No longer identifying with the mind. The mind then reflected consciousness as a formless essence. That's just awareness. The mind and awareness then just became one. There was no I. The mind is just a conditioning, a condition of consciousness that is experienced by that present moment awareness that just is, that is formless. Awareness no longer identifying with the mind. Awareness then came into its own nature of formless reality. And in that relating to formless reality, awareness then could relate from that is, just is. A non-personal awareness, a non-personal consciousness. Awareness without attachment to the mind for its meaning is simply awareness. It then becomes empty. Awareness is emptiness without identifications of form for its own meaning. There is no meaning to awareness. Awareness is just the meaning. Awareness then is living in relation to awareness. As Nisargadatta said, I am that. See? I am is awareness without identification to form for its meaning. It is simply just empty, free of all identification. It is a pure attention that just is. I am. And it is that I am that comes in relation then to truth, is no longer living in relation to the identified state of the I. Awareness no longer caught up in the illusion that it's a person or an I. This liberated state of consciousness is able then to relate from that is, that just is, the unmanifest, or whatever you call it, just whatever. This relating, this liberated sense or state is then just a pure attention. It is no longer an I, not a me. It is just empty, pure seeing. Awareness that is empty, no longer caught up in form for its meaning, relates from that is, just is, alive. In that relation, there is just seeing things as they are. That recognition of reality, of as is in everything that arises out of as is. One. So the deeper nature of self, the recognition of as is, awareness in relation from that is, sees into that is, there is no separation. Everything is of that. Everything is that. There is no separation. It is consciousness in its formlessness that is appearing as this. As consciousness that is prior to the conditioning, in its formless integrity, can live in relation to that is. Seeing all things arise out of that is. There's no separation. There's no I. There's no me. And then you see where you see from and what you see into are one. Everything is experienced by awareness, by consciousness. When there is an identification to the condition of mind, then the mind in its reflection of consciousness, in its state of unrealization. will reflect consciousness imitating mind. It reflects an individual, an idea of a person. Relating from the mind is an idea, a memory. But consciousness in liberation, relating from that is that. The mind reflects that. There's no separation. So thinking is happening within the field of consciousness. That is, knowing what is happening. So awakening is realization. And separation is an identification. Because consciousness in its formless essence can merge with anything, can be the direct experience of everything. When consciousness is in relation to reality, to that is, not the individual, not the I, in that direct relating, all things are directly experienced. Things are directly experienced as consciousness, not an idea. It is all happening. The liberated consciousness is a formless consciousness that is the same. There is nothing that can characterize consciousness. Consciousness just is. And as that, there is the direct experience of all things without losing the formless integrity of realized consciousness, relating from that is, seeing all things arise out of that. None of this that you experience can happen in that. So there is no one seeing, there is just seeing. In the beginning there was just seeing, a state of liberation. There was the joy of knowing reality, the non-personal consciousness that is experiencing this. And then there was the learning to become more established in that. Because form, with its thoughts, with its feeling, are of consciousness and have that pull on consciousness. So if one's mind is empty, if there is a seeing, then there is being pulled into thought forms, feelings. So anyway, in the beginning there was the becoming established in that realized state of consciousness, which is empty, which has no identification to thoughts or body mind for its meaning. It exists as it is, empty, as is, present. Yeah, present. And of course, within that emptiness, there is the no longer living in relation to the mind or the emotional body. Instead, there was living in relation to nothing, as is. You see, awareness was aware, empty, without identification for its meaning. Suddenly, it was relating. It was relating from a non-location of oneness that all things arise out of. Yeah. So suddenly there was just awareness living in relation to truth. Awareness, and it just is as is. There's no I, there's no idea of who you are anymore. There is just thinking happening or the feelings happening. These things are happening. But without the identification to the body-mind, 80%, I think, as Eckhart Tolle would have said, I said in an interview, and it's quite true, 80% of the contraction falls away. The identified contraction, the energy that goes into being an I or a me falls away, and what's left is just the functioning self, the functioning mind, the functioning emotional body, you see. And that awareness is free, liberated. This thinking, feeling is happening within the field of awareness, you see. And awareness is living in relation to nothing, a oneness, a state of non-location, you see. But everything is consciousness. Nothing exists outside of it. There are states of consciousness, there are conditions of consciousness, conditions we call thinking, conditions we call feeling, body, mind. And even then the body mind then begins to come into relation to truth or being or as is. As you begin to be, and allow the experience to happen, the patterns still arise, old patterns, but not the identifiable patterns, not the pattern of the I or the me, but just certainly the patterns of emotion, the patterns of mental memory still arise. But because of the seeing, because of the non-identification, what they call non-attachment awareness, awareness in relation to that is reality, the very attention becomes a movement. You see, identification is a reaction, it's a distortion, and a distortion has awareness identified with the body-mind, and the body-mind then reacts in suffering ways where it then begins to seek reality, which is a reaction to its own suffering, a motivation that comes from a contracted false sense of I. But in a realized state of consciousness, in a consciousness that is just simply aware, without attachment to mind. The mind not being separate from consciousness, in its true function, begins to imitate consciousness, begins to open up. So as patterns continue, as mental patterns continue, they're simply being seen by an attention that is realized, and that attention that is realized has the most profound effect on one's continual growth in a living way that is a realized consciousness. So suddenly, as liberated awareness in relation to truth, there being no one, a non-located sense of self, there is just a state of oneness you're seeing from that, and the very attention is the action. It is an action that transcends any form of identification to the self, the I, the me. It's simply just happening. Did you hear that? So for me, the awakening or realization is essentially the realization of true nature, and seeing how all things arise out of that just via seeing it, and how all things live in relation to true nature. Everything lives in relation to consciousness, and if consciousness is in a state of unrealization, in a state of separation, then all things will come into relation to that, the idea of who you think you are, you see. Your thinking and your feeling will reflect that. But instead of realized consciousness, there just simply is this happening. No, I didn't say that at all. Do you want the mic? I did.
I can't remember what I said.
Oh, you're so in the moment, aren't you? I don't even remember what I said. I was talking about something about realized consciousness.
You said instead.
The question was, did you say instead of? But I think what you actually said was in a state of.
Yes.
It was misheard as
okay.
instead of.
Thank you, Mandy, thank you. In a state of ignorance or a state of identification, a state of separation, all things live in relation to a dishonesty of consciousness. A consciousness that is identified with form creates the I. But in a state of realized consciousness, a consciousness that is realized of its origin being that of no location, a state of oneness. Awareness in its emptiness is formless. Relating from that begins to just sees, is a movement that sees all things in relation to consciousness, because it is consciousness that is experiencing all things. So realization, one's attention, changes, modifies all things. So that's the skinny on my realization, and a quick thing on my integration. But there is no one to integrate, right? There is just seeing, and things living in relation to your seeing, and who is seeing is nothing, is no thing. Nothing can characterize or define what you first are. You just simply are seeing. everything that is happening is in relation to your seeing. Your seeing is what is experiencing what is happening, and there is no separation between what is seeing and what is happening. Everything is of consciousness. You are formless. You are a formless consciousness, bright or conditioned, relating from that is, seeing all things arise out of that. There is just that. Where you see from as that, everything is of that. There's no separation. Do we have any questions on this? Is there anything that you may not have understood? I'm quite abstract.
Please
Sorry.
wait for the mic.
I think I heard you right. I was interested, you used the word dishonesty of
Yes.
consciousness,
Yeah.
which is an interesting, I mean, it's loaded.
Absolutely.
But,
Yeah. It's good debate.
and yet, I guess from other people one's heard or read, one might argue that a so-called distorted or separate consciousness is simply what is as well. That's simply what's arising. It's consciousness arising as an apparent state of separation, which would seem to be a rather more neutral way of describing it. But you seem to take a particular stance of it being dishonest. So I just wonder if you'd say something about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm aware that it's quite controversial. Identification is a distortion. Consciousness losing its sense of oneness, loses its orientation to that is. You can identify with form. And in that identification there's a distortion, and although it's something that is happening, it's not separate, but there is suffering. So you could say, I could use the word dishonesty for the word suffering. When I say dishonesty, there is just identifying. It's not like it's someone's fault or there's someone to blame using the word dishonesty. It's just a dishonesty of consciousness. Because what can happen with seeking is there can be, they can objectify the ego as something that it needs to be dealt with or done with. When in fact it's you are the ego. It is the ego that awakens, it is the consciousness that is experiencing all things. But in its identification, there is a dishonesty. For me anyway, there was a dishonesty.
Steve, I think at the beginning of your talks you talked a little bit about thinking and the idea perhaps of realizing thinking wasn't getting you anywhere. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
I got caught out. I was at college a month or so before a realization, whatever you call it. I was having quite an intense debate with the sociology teacher, as I always did because I was seeking. And sociology is a very emotive subject. that challenges identity roles and all these things. And considering I was looking for myself, my debates were always intense. And one particular day, the debate was very intense, and everyone had left the room. There was just me and the tutor, and I was arguing my point, and she just looked at me and she just said, "Steve, you're not your thoughts or your feelings." And no one had ever told me that before. No one had ever said that. That's a really strange thing to say to someone, you know. You're not your thoughts or your feelings. And it's a strange thing to say to someone, because most people, especially me at that time, the whole orientation to my life, my awareness was very much caught up in thought and feeling as an orientation to reality. And it was devastating, what she said. Devastating, because when she said that, I knew that was absolutely true. And I couldn't even answer with a yes or no. I just had to walk away and know that, yeah, there's truth in that. But I was not defensive anyway. I was very broken. I was falling apart anyway, you know. And about 2 weeks or 3 weeks after that was when I found myself in my apartment at night, knowing something drastically was wrong. You know, not knowing who I was and all of those things. At the same time, I had an amazing 12-step program I was working. For those that don't know 12 steps, it's a principles designed to help people recover from addiction problems, you see. And I'd spent 3.5 years working these principles in my life, to the point where I'd mastered the art of principle. And of course, the principle was always understood by my mind, and always the outcome was felt in my heart. So the modification to one's recovery came from my understanding and the feeling of feeling better as a result, as an offshot of working the program. But this time, 3.5 years later, there was something else in me that wasn't expressing itself, something, and it felt like it was dying, to sound dramatic. I know it sounds dramatic, but it really felt like there was something in me dying. And so when Sheila said, "You're not your thoughts or your feelings," she really got me at a good time. She really did, because it went straight in, and it was a direct hit. And I found myself a few weeks later in an apartment, knowing there was something wrong, and I knew it was so wrong that there was a high risk that I was going to drink again, go back into the alcohol and drink again. The suffering was great. And so in that moment, there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, and there was then a wondering of, what do I need to do? And I knew that I'd worked the program for about 3.5 years so well that, and it worked on all the levels, the mental levels, the emotional levels, and I seemed to be okay, but I wasn't okay. And what worried me was that there was something in me that was wanting to express itself, or was not known, and I knew this program couldn't get to it. There's something far deeper than thought and feeling, and that's why she'd had busted me. I knew that. So I sat there and I went through the program thinking, what have I not done? Because up until then I'd done everything you could imagine possible to do with process around the addictive self, becoming a more whole self. And I got to the 3rd step, and it said, we hand our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. And I remember thinking, I've not done that. I haven't done that at all. I've used my thinking in the best way it can be used. I totally. The what? We hand over our will and our life over to the care of a power greater than ourselves. Okay, basically what that means is we let go of our thinking and we let go of our feelings and we learn another way through the dilemma, the emotional dilemma that we've created. And it really means that you trust someone else and you learn a different way, you see. And I hadn't done that. I'd intensely used my mind. And that's fine, because it kind of, I developed wonderfully. But what was missing was authenticity, was knowing who am I. So after 3.5 years, I was left with who am I. And with the knowledge knowing that I hadn't handed over, and the knowledge of what Sheila Jervis said was absolutely disastrous to me. And that's when my thinking and my perceptual self came to an end in that moment, as a tool for meaning, as a tool for reality. So in that moment, I just let go of everything. I just suddenly became aware that this is what had happened, and it was very profound. Just an awareness, not doing anything. And I knew that I had to somehow go beyond the thinking, go beyond the thoughts in whatever way. And so I did. I let go. And it's not something you can teach someone to do. This is something that just happens in the moment. Everyone is different in their response to reality or separation or whatever. But for me, it was just absolutely knowing that thought was not reality and just absolutely letting go of it. But before I could let go of it, I knew instinctively, intuitively, that it had to be accepted totally. I had to totally accept Steve for who he was, without trying to change anything. So there was no denying it, just accepting it and letting go. And that's what happened. In that moment of awareness, the thoughts kind of dissipated. The energy that was put into thinking, put into the idea of Steve, dissipated. The contraction of mind began to open. And looking back now, what happened was, where there was a letting go and acceptance, remaining just aware, the mind imitated that. The mind then just opened up to that, knowing that thought is not reality. But as it opened, the contraction opened, there was actually going beyond the meaning of that contraction. There was going beyond the identity of that contraction, and that was scary. There was a lot of fear. But because as it opened and it began to imitate consciousness that is formless, there was the disappearing. The going beyond what you know is the disappearing. So what was left was just awareness. And for the first time in my life, I experienced peace of mind. Peace of mind, you see. No longer was my awareness caught up in thinking for its meaning. It wasn't trying to do anything with the mind. The mind now just simply reflected a liberated state of mental awareness, see.
Was that a gradual process? Happened over a long period of time?
No, it happened all in one go. It was
a kind of sudden shift.
Sudden shift. Mine was a sudden shift. It happened. The awakening or realization happened in one evening, within minutes. But the integration takes longer. It takes time. But the initial recognition of reality or liberation of consciousness can happen just very quickly. And the process for me was very much just accepting the thinking as it was, knowing it's not reality, and really knowing that, and just simply letting go. And in the letting go and the accepting, which are two kind of the same thing. To let something go is to let it be. To accept it is to let it be. To surrender is to let it be. It's all the same. In doing so, without instruction, just intuitively knowing that thinking is not reality, there simply was the acceptance, the letting go, and the mind then imitated the state of consciousness that suddenly became very honest in knowing that that is not reality. And then the mind, then there was just this pure reflection of peace of mind, awareness, just awareness. There was no separation between mind and awareness. Yeah.
Had you ever felt any of this type of experience before through substances or anything in your previous?
No, I didn't take. The only thing I used was alcohol. There was no drugs. Yeah, there was when I had my first drink when I was very young, I don't know, I can't remember, 9 or 10, I do remember that the effects of alcohol were, because alcohol was a disinhibitor, it relaxed all the contractions in my body, and there was a real sense of liberation, but it was not a realized sense of liberation. It was an experience of a lack of contraction, so to speak, where awareness could then just be aware. But there was no realization in that. It was totally dependent upon the effects of alcohol disinhibiting one's fear, one's contraction. Yeah.
Is that authenticity that you're talking about, is that what you're referring to happened when that process happened and that self-acceptance? Yeah, the authenticity, no, that was just accepting. That is probably an honest thing, but it's not authenticity. Authenticity is the realization of consciousness that appropriates, as Mandy would say, appropriates form. You know, that is the authenticity, is remaining simply as you are, as awareness, with everything happening. But with a realized consciousness or realized awareness, there is the relating from the non-personal and everything arising out of it, you see. That is authenticity.
So I kind of get caught up in, you were mentioning I had to accept Steve exactly as he was, unconditionally. But I guess I get caught up in, well, isn't a part of Steve the thing that's not accepting Steve unconditionally? I mean, how do you accept, like, does this make any sense?
Not at all, no. But that's it. I really, the thing is, I didn't come via a seeking route. I kind of just fell apart and kind of realized something, you know. So I lack sometimes the perspective where people are coming from. When there was before realization, if there's such a thing, to me there is. I think if you're in a state of suffering, then that is happening, of course. But in a state of realization, there is just that, experiencing all of this, and sometimes it can be difficult. There can be aspects of Steve still happening that are difficult, that still needs to be seen, that still needs to be modified, that still needs to come in alignment with truth, or consciousness, or realization. That continues. But the idea, the identification goes. Realization is the end of that, you see. Patterns still remain, but the 80% of energy put into the contracted sense of I and me just falls away, you see. Prior the awakening, the struggle with Steve was, it just simply came to an end that one evening. But before then, I never considered whether thought or feeling was real or not, or didn't really know what honesty meant. It's only upon realization that I came to know that. So I came from that way, really. Does that allow you to ask the question again? What is your question now?
All right. I
Is
mean,
that okay?
Yeah. That was great. Yeah, sure.